let's take a look at the additional closures sample. I've got the additional closures pattern here, and following my instructions, I've cut 2 from muslin. So I've got my pattern and 2 pieces of muslin underneath here. I have notched where my fold line is, so there are little notches here and down here. And I've traced my center front line using tailor's chalk. Here's my center front line. Hopefully you can see that. My center front line is there. I'll mark this in friction marker as well. You can use tailor's transfer chalk with some transfer paper and a serrated tracing wheel. While your work is here, you can fold your transfer paper with the chalk facing out on both sides. Place it in between the 2 pieces of muslin. Flatten everything, including your pattern, and then roll over your center front line with your tracing wheel, and it will transfer the marks to both pieces of muslin at the same time. I'm just going to mark these so it's a little bit easier to see. But your center front line is 3/4 of an inch from your fold line. So if you know where your notches are, you can measure 3/4 of an inch over and then draw your center front line. So I'm just marking my center front line. I've transferred mine with tracing paper and a tracing wheel, but just so you can see it on the video, I'm copying these with some friction marker. So there's the pattern, notches, center front line. Here's my 2 copies cut out of muslin with respective notches. Center front line, same thing here. Now the beauty of working with muslin is there technically is a right and wrong side to it, but for samples we can always use whichever side of the fabric we want to. So when we're doing this sample, we're going to be creating what are called plackets. Plackets are just areas of a garment that hold some kind of closure. Either a button placket that holds buttons and buttonholes, or snaps, or hooks and eyes, like we're going to be working on here. What I want you to do is take each of your samples, fold them along your fold line notches, so that, and I've made a mountain fold here so that I can still see my center front line. We still want to be able to see that showing out. And I'm going to finger press this fold. If you're using stiff enough, medium weight muslin, you should be able to just push this with your fingertips, and the pressure of your fingers and the heat from your fingers should be enough to create a nice fold, a little crease, so you don't necessarily have to iron that and lose any marks that you may have on here. Just want to make sure my center front it's not quite even, so I'm going to redo this because there's a little bit of deviation on my center front line here. I can tell that it's not perfectly parallel to my fold line, so I'm going to iron off this mark. You can see how it moves too far to the right. I'm going to iron this off and redraw this again 3/4 of an inch from that folded edge. Okay, good. Now I want you to do 3 closures on this sample. So you're going to be hand sewing 3 closures onto here. And in order to position our closures properly on both pieces of muslin, I want you to take your sample and fold it in half lengthwise. And give it a little bit of a crease right here where that center front is. where that center front line is. As you unfold your fabric, you should see a little fold right there, and mark where that is. And then take your fabric again and fold this in half. So one edge will fold in half, and we'll make another mark there. And then this can fold in half as well. And make a mark here. You can also fold it in half once lengthwise, and then fold it in half again lengthwise. However you need to make 4 folds in it, well, 3 folds at this place, but that'll get the center, and then we'll have a halfway point here and a halfway point here. So this is halfway between these 2 edges. This is halfway between these 2 edges. And as long as we have 3 evenly spaced marks, that's all we need. I'm gonna set that aside and repeat the same for my other piece. I've got my center front line, I've got my fold notches. I'm going to fold up along my fold notches and finger press this fold in place. I think I did a better job with marking my center front on here. It looks a lot more parallel, but I will check that with my ruler to make sure that it is 3/4 of an inch all the way across. Yeah, that's looking much better. So I'm not going to make any changes to that, but I will go ahead and fold my fabric once, give it a good press with my fingers, and twice. Unfold it and mark where those folds are. Now on an actual pattern, you would already have tiny little tailor's tacks to indicate where your buttons or snaps or whatever closures are going on there. But for the sake of this sample, we're just going to fold our fabric so we get 3 evenly spaced marks. Make sure that they match up. You don't want marks offset. We don't want 2 marks going in different directions. We want them to be nice and lined up with one another. The first closure I want you all to install will be snaps. And snaps can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. You can get metal, you can get plastic, either will work. I have some clear plastic ones that I'm going to use, and hopefully you guys can see this on the video. I just don't have any metal ones with me right now. They come in a variety of different shapes and sizes and colors. These are some smaller clear snaps. I've got some larger clear snaps that I ordered off of Amazon. What's important to note when you're ordering or purchasing snaps for this sample is that you get sew-on snaps. And the way to know whether they're sew-on snaps is whether or not they have little holes in them. See if I can get this in focus. There we go. So you can see around the edge of this snap, there's a little hole. I can actually poke my awl through that hole. This is an awl, a little pointy object that we use. But I can poke right through it. And even if you have metal snaps, there should still be a series of small holes around it. Here's another type of snap, much, much larger. Kind of a novelty size snap. This might be a little bit easier to demonstrate. Notice that, again, there are holes all the way around the pieces so that you can actually get a needle and thread through each of these. These are an example of snaps that you do not want to use for the sample. These snaps have prongs on them that have to poke through the fabric, and these have to be installed with a press. These are no-sew snaps, so these are what you want to avoid. We need to be able to hand sew our snaps into place. But to demonstrate a little bit further about snaps, snaps will always come in 2 pieces. There will be a female end that just has a hole in it, and a male side for obvious reasons, so that one piece can snap into the other. When you purchase snaps, sometimes you'll get them on a sheet of cardboard. They'll come on like a thin piece of cardboard or something. And you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, I only see one snap here. Where's my male and female end? They're usually snapped together on either side of the cardboard. So you just have to unsnap them. And you'll get both male and female ends. And mine just fell in the garbage can. Here we go. There it is. You'll have both the male and female ends here. Let me see if I can zoom in on these. I don't really want to focus. Here's my female plastic snap. It's just a flat piece of plastic. And here's the male end. It's got that little nib on it right there. So I'm going to use these plastic snaps to install on my sample, but feel free to use whatever kind of snaps you want as long as they're sew-on snaps. So I'm going to grab my samples here, and I'm going to work with this sample over here. I mean, they're identical. I'm just going to grab one of them. Doesn't really matter which one you get. I will assume that this portion of my sample is sitting up against the body of my wearer. So this would be closer to the body of my wearer, whereas this side will then flip over and close on top of this piece. So we're essentially putting both of the center front lines together. So with this one, when it comes to snaps, it's kind of up to the user, up to the wearer, up to the designer, how you want to install the snaps. Do you want to put the female end closer to the body and the male end away from the body, or vice versa? I prefer to put the male end, this is the end with that little nibby on it, I prefer to put that closer to the body, because if, imagine there's a body here, someone's body, and this is sitting up against their body. If I put the male end on this side and we figure, okay, and we're going to close this, I've got to push this down. The male end needs to get pushed down towards the wearer of the body. So it can put a little bit of pressure on someone when you're having to push these little nibby bits up against their body. So I usually put the male end on the side of the garment closest to the wearer's body, so that when you go to attach it, you've got the female end attached to this side, and then you can just push, and you're pushing most of the pressure of that male end of the snap towards whoever's dressing the person rather than pushing it towards your wearer's body. So I'm going to take the male end of my snap and position it right in the center of that little mark right there, which is the advantage of having clear snaps, so you can clearly see where that mark is, and I want to get it as close to being on center as possible. For this sample, I'm going to hand sew through both layers of muslin because I still got 2 layers. I'm going to sew through both layers. On an actual garment, you would just try to catch the top layer of fabric so that you don't have any threads or knots or anything coming out of the back. But for the sample, just to get accustomed to this technique, I'm going to sew through both layers. I have a needle and thread already prepared. I'm using a single length of thread, so I've tied only one end of my thread, and there's a teeny little knot at the end. Now, the orientation of your holes on the snaps does not matter. It can be diagonal, they can be in cardinal directions, it doesn't matter. No one's going to know the difference. But I'm going to pick up my work and kind of hold my snap in place. I'm going to go down through both layers of muslin. There's my needle coming out of the back. I'm going down and back up through one of those holes. Now my knot will anchor itself right there. And I'm going to do the same stitch again. I don't want to get too close because it'll go out of focus. I'm going to do the same stitch again, still holding my snap in place, down through both layers of muslin and back up through the hole. Again, there's my needle going through all the layers. Pull my thread through. So now I've created a little loop of thread to catch that edge of my snap. I'm going to do that 2 more times at the very least, down through both layers of thread, up through the hole in my snap. That's 2 and 3. Now, depending on the size of your snap, you may want to do this 4 or 5 times. I think 3 or 4 times will suffice. I'll do one more. Down through both layers of my muslin and up through the hole in my snap. So that's 4 little loops of thread through that hole in my snap. Now I'm going to move up to this hole just so I can keep holding the left hand side of my snap. I'm going to travel my needle. I'm going to go back down through all the layers of muslin, pull my needle through here. So now I've got my thread on the back of my sample. And then I'm going to push my needle up. This is where you get accustomed to kind of feeling where your needle is. I've got my needle in my right hand. I've got it back here. Make sure my snap is in position. I'm going to push my needle up through that topmost hole. It's very much like sewing a button. And on the back here, you can see where that little stitch has traveled up to the next hole. And then again, I'm going to go outside, just beside that hole there, down through both pieces of muslin and back up through the hole in my snap. There's my needle going through all the layers of my muslin, and I'll pull that through. And again, I'll do that about 4 times. That's 2. 3, again, going through the muslin. I've always got my left hand back here so I can feel when my needle pokes through all of my fabric. And 1 time 4. There we go. So I've got 2 of my holes. Now I got to secure the other 2, but now I can release this because 1/2 of my snap is already in place. I don't have to worry about it going anywhere. I'm going to travel again. I'm going to go outside of my snap, go down through my muslin, pull my needle through the back of my sample, and then working with my working hand, my right hand with the needle in my hand, I'm working back here. I've got my right hand back here. Make sure my snap is in position, and I'm going to push my needle up through the next hole. I'm just working counterclockwise. You can work clockwise, counterclockwise. You can thread this hole and then that one and then this one, and it doesn't matter what order you're going. I'm just going to turn my work a little bit so I can put my needle down. Again, I'm going down outside of the snap, down through all layers of my fabric, and then traveling the point of the needle up through the hole of the snap. And just start wrapping my thread around that edge about 4 times so I keep it consistent. That's 3. And 4. Okay, just got 1 more to go. So again, I'm going to place my needle outside, somewhere back here. When I say outside, I mean I'm not going back into the hole of the snap. I'm just going just beside the edge of the snap. Pull my needle, my needle to the back, all my thread to the back, and then working kind of blindly with my needle back here. I'm going to push this up through all the layers and through that last hole in my snap. And then repeat the same process, needle down through all the fabric, back up through that same hole, and loop my thread over the edge about 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's all 4 holes. Now, depending on the snap you have, you may have more holes. These have 5. Make sure you secure all of them. So if you've got 5, you're going to end up having to do this 5 times. Now I'm done. I'm going to take a tiny stitch just beside my snap. I'm just going in and out through a few fibers of thread. Pull my thread through, take another tiny little stitch through a few fibers of thread, and as this loop of thread comes through, before this loop closes, I'll put my needle through this loop of thread and pull everything to anchor a little knot there. Now you can place your knot on the front. I'm just keeping it consistent because I have this knot here. You can also anchor a knot on the back. Either will work. Now I can trim my thread just as it is, but I'm going to do something called traveling. I'm going to travel my needle in between the two layers of fabric. So you've got to have your hand back here to make sure you don't feel the needle poking through here. I'm going to travel, you can kind of see it, my needle through the two layers of fabric. So you shouldn't see the needle on either side, just pokes back out. You can do this if you want to. You don't have to, but this is a good practice to have for hiding your threads. And as my thread comes out over here, rather than having a tuft of thread kind of sitting right here next to my snap, now I've got my working thread over here. I can pull the thread taut, snip it right next to the fabric, and that thread will kind of, since it's under tension when you pull it, once it releases tension after you snip it, that thread will kind of slide back inside in between the two layers of fabric. So it's less likely to fray. It's now hiding in there, and no one will be able to see that little cut end of thread. Let's go ahead and put the female, I'm just putting another knot in my thread. Let's get the female side done on our snap, and we'll move on to the hooks and eyes. So as I mentioned, this would be the side sitting closest to the body of our wearer. And then this other side, we'd have that center front line kind of overlapping. So both center front lines are going to have to sit in the center front of the body. So since I put my snap on this uppermost cross mark, I'm going to put the female end on this uppermost cross mark. So when I put the two together, they will snap together properly. So let me set this aside, and I will work on this one, doing the female. End of the snap, and it is the same process. I'm going to center that snap on that cross mark. I'm going to come up through both layers of fabric. There's my needle, and come up through one of these holes in my snap, anchor my knot in my work, and then loop it over and over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Put my needle down through my work and travel it up to another one of these holes. I'm going to have to pull my needle all the way through, pull that thread back there, and then travel my needle up through the next hole. Keep in mind with these female snaps, remember they're always going to have a hole in their middle. They need that in order to engage with the male end of the snap. Don't sew through this middle hole. You just have to get the holes around the perimeter. So make sure you're checking to make sure that you're only sewing through the outer holes. It's hard to see here, but there's my hole in the middle. So I don't want to sew through that, but 1, 2, 3, and 4 holes that I need to sew through. Hold this in place. I've got my thread going up through my next hole. I'm going to go down and back up. 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, put my needle beside my snap, pull my thread to the back of my work, and work my way to the next hole. And once again, wrapping my thread around the edge, down through both layers of muslin, up through that hole. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you do the same for the next one. For this one, I'm just going to show you, as I mentioned, you've got all these stitches visible because I'm going through both layers. But just as I traveled my needle through the 2 layers of fabric on the male snap, when I finished everything out, you can do the same thing with these, where you can place your needle in between the 2 layers, excuse me, of fabric and travel the needle and get it close to that next hole. So I can feel underneath here. I've got my fingers sitting under here so I can feel that my needle has not poked through and it's just traveling in between the 2 layers of fabric. And I've just brought the end of my needle up through that last hole in my snap. So this is how you would sew snaps or hooks and eyes or any kind of hand sewn finishes like this without having your seam show on the front. So you have to it takes a little bit of finesse to get accustomed to feeling the needle, keeping your hand underneath and feeling the needle underneath, making sure it's not poking through all the layers of fabric. Same thing when you go to pick up your fabric. Instead of going through both layers, you're only going through one, so I'm not picking up too much there. Let me try that again. Just going through the topmost layer of fabric. I can still see my needle though. Topmost layer of fabric through the hole. All right, it doesn't. And so again, I've got my fingers underneath here so I can feel whether my needle's coming through. So that time I only caught the topmost layer of my muslin, so you can't see my needle back here. So you shouldn't see any stitches. I'll do this one, traveling my needle just through the topmost layer of fabric. You don't have to do this. I'm just showing you this is what you would do on an actual garment, so you wouldn't see any stitches on the front of your work. So there are my 4 stitches, nothing back here. Take 2 little tiny stitches and anchor your thread. And travel to finish off your snaps. Pull this taut, snip close to the fabric without cutting the fabric itself, and let that thread kind of hide itself down there. So that's our 2 snaps, and you can practice putting one on top of the other. See if it snaps together. Should hold tight. So the next closure we're going to look at will be the hooks and eyes, wire hooks and eyes specifically. There are different types of hooks and eyes, and I want you all to practice with the wire hooks and eyes. I've got several examples of hooks and eyes. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes and designs. These are more elaborate kind of wedding style hooks and eyes with a little rhinestone on them. I don't recommend using these. They're not going to work for our particular sample, but just know that if you want them visible, you know, on a certain garment, you can use decorative hooks and eyes, but we won't be needing those. I also don't recommend putting really big hooks and eyes on there because we're going to put it onto the same sample and that could cause a really big lump in our sample. But if you do feel like you've got a hard time holding, you know, you need larger snaps, larger hooks and eyes, maybe your hand shakes or you can't see quite as well, you might want to consider getting a larger size. The size of the hooks and eyes are determined by a numerical system. The smaller the number, the smaller the hooks and eyes. For example, I've got size 1 and size 2 hooks and eyes here in white. If I can open this, and you'll see that they are 2 different sizes. Here is a size 1 hook and a size 2 hook. So here's the size 1 at the top here. And here's a size 2. So just from one size to the next, they go as small as like a 0, and I think as large as like 9 or 10, maybe larger. So there's a size 1 hook, there's a size 2 hook. You can see the difference in the sizes. And the corresponding eyes will also come in different sizes. You can find hooks and eyes sold with an eye that looks like this, kind of this curly Q shape. Here's a size 2 eye, so you can see the difference in the two sizes. I'm going to work with my size 2 just so you can see a little bit more what we're getting ready to do. You may also find, when you're shopping for stuff, you'll find hooks that come with eyes. These are also size 2 hooks and eyes, but they are metal finish rather than white. You might also find bars, wire bars included. I want you guys to get accustomed to using these eyes, but the bars work just as well. So for the sample, stick to the hook, the wire hook, and eye. Just know that the bars are also in there. I'm going to use my metal ones for my sample so you can see them against my muslin. Now, when you're working with these hooks and eyes, your hook essentially hooks through the eye, and both pieces will sit like this. You can see it's pretty secure. You can tug them apart. They're going to be really secure. And when we go to install these hooks and eyes for this particular sample, and it kind of varies when you're working on other garments and the like, but for this sample, while we're working with these hooks and eyes, where these two connect, right here, where the two of these connect, is where we want to place these at center front. So we want their connection point to lie on that center front line that we placed on our sample. So you can already see the positioning for these. The eye is going to have to sit just over the center front line, ever so slightly. So we're going to end up stitching it closer to this side or to one side of the center front, whereas the hook, part of the hook is going to end up sitting pretty close, if not right along our center front line, and these two little curly Q nibbies, these curly Q bits of wire here, will sit to the opposite side of center front. So we're going to install these just below our snaps, at these 2 points. When we go to install these, we want the hook side. Remember, this is the side that's sitting closer to our person, to our wearer. So we've got the male end of the snap here. This is where our wearer is going to be. I'm going to put my eye on this side, on the side that's closer to my wearer. This side where I have my female snap, I'm going to place my hook. And when I place it, I want my hook to be facing up. And I'll show you that a little bit closer, so maybe it'll help to explain it this way, where this side, the eye is sitting on this side, and the hook sitting on the opposite side, and they hook into each other. Sitting like this. So I'm going to go ahead and install my eye, because I can kind of see where that's going to go, with my eye just overlapping center front, and then we'll work on the hook side. So there's my notch, and I want to position my eye just like that, with a portion of this eye extending towards the folded side, folded edge of my sample. Got my needle and thread ready, still using a single length of thread, and I'm going to place a little knot in it because clearly I forgot to do that, because of course I did. All right, single length of thread with a tiny knot in the end. Same principle. I'm going to pick up my sample here, position my eye so it's just overlapping the center front line. go in through all my layers and up through one of those loops of metal on my hook and eye. On my eye, I should say. Anchor my knot, going back through again. I'm going through both layers of fabric. You can see my needle coming out of the back. I'm not too concerned about hiding my stitches right now. Well, I'm not going to do that for this sample. And coming back up through that little eye of metal. Again, in and out. That's 2 loops. Three. And 4. I'll do 2 more just to be safe. 5, 6, why not? Just to make sure that that doesn't go anywhere. 4 will suffice. I just did 2 more because why not? And I still got threads poking through the back here. And then again, I'm going to travel my needle. I'm going to go beside the hook, beside the eye, and put my needle down, travel up to the opposite side, going up through the other eye. If you find that this is difficult to do, you can still just put your needle beside the eye, pull your thread through to the back of your work, reposition the eye, and then working kind of blind, I got my hand back here, push the needle up through the second eye, you know. Travel however you need to. I'm not going to know the difference. And once again, just going to loop over this about 4 or 5 times. Obviously on an actual garment, you'd be using thread similar to the color of your fabric. So I've done about 5, I'll do 6, 1 more. There are more decorative types of stitches, blanket stitches or mattress stitches, I think they're referred to as, that you can also use, but this is quick. This is much faster. All right, so I've got about 5, 6 stitches holding each of these. Again, I'm going to pick up a few little fibers of fabric. And again, teeny little stitch, picking up a few fibers. And as this loop closes up, stick my needle through the loop, pull it through, anchor it with a knot, and then I'm going to travel my thread between the 2 layers of muslin, keeping my finger underneath my work so I can feel whether the needle comes out through the back, and it hasn't. Travel my needle somewhere else away from my work, doesn't matter where. Pull this taut, pull the thread taut, cut the thread close to the fabric without cutting the fabric, and let the tension of the thread slide itself back into place. So make sure you've got the orientation of this hook correct, because otherwise it may not close properly. And get my thread ready again, because I'm going to sew the hook into place. Of course, I'm trying to put a knot in my thread and it is fighting me. Remember to wax your thread if need be. It'll help prevent your thread from tangling on itself. Okay, I've got my thread ready, got my little knot in the end. Now, the orientation for this hook is very, very important when we go to do this. So if it helps you to kind of place the hook in the correct orientation first and then move your fabric into place so you can be sure which side is going where. Remember, you can look at the shape of the hook. This is the flatter side that has little holes in it that we're going to sew to our fabric. So this is a nice flat end. Then it hooks up and around. This end up here at the top, this end that hooks up and around, that's what's going to hook onto our eye when we go to sew this. So this flatter side will go to our fabric over here. If my hook is oriented like this with the flat side facing up, and I place my sample on top like this, my hook needs to be oriented in this direction. So let me scoot this over to my other sample. This is the side that has the female end of my snap. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to place this in such a way that it's centered on that tailor's tack with the edge of my hook right along that center front line, and the flat side of the hook, this flat side that has little holes in it, is laying flat against my fabric. Do not try to install it with this side of the hook, the top part, down on your fabric. You're going to have trouble. You're not going to be able to close anything. So remember this flat side, where the little holes are, lay that flat on your fabric. So your little hook should be poking up towards you as you're sewing. And have that centered right about there. So I'm going to sew this into place over here. Now there are different schools of thought for how to sew on hooks and eyes. I will show you the method that I utilize. Again, I'm going to anchor my thread coming up through one of those holes in my wire hook, making sure I've got it positioned properly. Okay, it's not pretty, but that thread is in there. I'm going to travel my needle up to the other hole. Notice I just kind of knocked my hook out of the way, but I know generally that's where that eye is going to be. Doesn't matter. Just going to pull my thread all the way through and then thread my needle through the eye of that hook. Perfectly fine. No one would know the difference if I hadn't caught it on camera. All right, gone through there about 5-6 times. Again, it doesn't look pretty, but it's in place. Now, some people will just sew these two holes into place and leave it like that, and that's okay. But notice how this tends to want to flop around. It's not super secure, and it can make for some strange things when you're trying to close this, especially on the front of a garment. So I'm going to travel my needle again. I'm going to go down through my work, pull my thread to the back of my work, and I'm going to pull my thread up right about here, somewhere around this edge, close to where this hook is, this open edge of this hook. Now there's a few ways you can do this. It's hard to see on the video, but you've got this open edge of the hook. This is what I'm going to be securing into place. Some of the larger hooks and eyes, these wire hooks and eyes, are a little bit bigger. You might notice this tiny little hump right here. Some people like to sew underneath that hump. They like to put their needle just under that little hump of wire right there. But this hook and eye is so small that I don't think I can get my needle through there. This little hump acts kind of like a semi-locking mechanism. So when the eye comes through, it takes a little bit of force to pull it back out to get it over this little hump. But if you're working with a large enough hook and eye, sometimes that little hump there is large enough to put your needle through, and you'll bring your needle up around one side, under that little hump, and then back down the other side. For this, because it's such a tiny little space, I don't want to try to risk it with putting my needle in there. I'm instead just going to hook my needle right through here in my hook. But when you're doing this, you want to make sure you don't, again, you want to use single length of thread. You don't want too much thickness, too much thread in here, because if you put too much thread that gets stuck in here, then your eye can't really rest in this little hook, in that little divot there. So I'm going to travel I've still got my thread here on the back, and I've got my needle on my right hand back here. I'm going to bring my needle up alongside one side of that hook area, if I can see what I'm doing. All right, there we go. It's kind of sitting just below the hook down here. I'm going to pull this up. This is just going through the fabric. It's not picked up any part of the hook itself. It's just coming up beside the hook. And I'm going to slide my thread into that hook so it sits down in this little divot here and comes out the other side. And then I'll descend my needle back down just beside where that hook is. So back down on the other side and pull my thread through. I want to make sure that thread actually goes under that hook. So I came up from here, I went through the hook, thread's coming back out the other side, and I put my needle back down. I'm going to repeat that at least 2 more times. There's my needle coming up through my work. Pass that thread into that hook, put my needle back down through the other side. And as that goes through, I want to make sure that thread is actually underneath that hook. That looks good. So there's 2. And I'll do that one more time. Okay, so we've got 3 lines of stitching, and now this hook isn't going anywhere, not without the fabric with it. I'm going to bring my needle back up through this side of my work. Again, you can put a knot on the back. Doesn't make a difference for the sample, but just to keep consistent, I'm just going to knot my work on this side, take a few little fibers with my needle, and again, tiny little stitch, picking up a couple of fibers. And as this loop of thread starts to close, I'll put my needle through that loop, pull everything tight, get a little knot to anchor it, and then I will travel my needle between both layers of fabric, keeping my fingers underneath my work so I can feel if it pokes through too far. Notice how I keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because I can feel it poking too far. You have to kind of pull back and then push and pull back and push. There's a lot of push and pull with hand sewing. So there's my needle traveling through both layers of fabric. I'm going to pull my thread up over here. It doesn't matter where it travels as long as it's going somewhere. Pull my thread taut, snip my thread close to my fabric without snipping my fabric, and allow the thread to slide itself back into place. So we've got 2 closures done. We've got our snap. That snaps. And we've got our hook and eye. Let me see if I can zoom in so you can see the operation for the hook and eye. Here's our hook. Here's our eye. The hook hooks into the eye and snaps into place. So there's the hook. It wraps around the eye, snaps into place. So there's our hook and eye in place. Here's our snap. Nice and taut. What we want to avoid, notice I'm trying to keep everything as straight as possible. We don't want the samples, going all which ways and all kinds of different directions. We are essentially trying to line up our center front lines with our closures. So if you're seeing your sample doing this or doing this, you might have to rip out some stitches and redo something. Make sure you're following the orientation and the positioning for everything so that they're in the right place. Now the third one, we've got another tailor's tack, little cross marks down here. I want you to install a third closure. Feel free to install another snap down here or install another hook and eye down here. Maybe if you have the hooks and eyes with little bars, you can try installing the bars. I'll show you just the positioning for those bars in case you're unsure of where those should go. Your hooks would be exactly the same orientation down here. Remember, keeping the flat side against the fabric. If you decide you want to sew a bar instead of an eye, it's a little bit easier to position those. You don't have to put the eye just over the center front line and all that nonsense. Your hook would still be oriented the same way on this side that overlaps where the wearer, this would be the side that the wearer is going to have on their body. This would be the other side. So your hook would go in the same orientation. Your bar would lay right on center front, straddling your cross mark. So it would be centered on that cross mark and lay right along the center line here. So you could try installing a hook and bar if you have those. I'm going to show you a trouser hook and bar. It's not required to have the trouser hook and bar for the sample book, but it is good to have them. And you will absolutely need trouser hooks and bars for garments down the line. Just so you can see what these look like. I've got several different examples of trouser hooks and bars. I have some examples here that are no-sew trouser hooks and bars. These are what you want to avoid. Here's one of the hooks. You see, it's still got that hook-like shape, but it's got prongs similar to what I showed you on the snaps. So this is meant to push into the fabric itself, and there's all kinds of backers and bars and all kinds of things. These are a little bit faster, kind of, sort of. I think they look a little bit cleaner on garments, but these have to be ordered, so you won't likely have those. You're not going to find those at Joann's. But for sew-on trouser hooks and bars, which are awesome, these are great to have for skirts and trousers. They're designed to go onto waistbands. Our tiny wire hooks and eyes are good for the top of a zipper, the backs of dresses. When you have another hook or another closure like a zipper or something installed, you can then use these little hooks and eyes to finish off the very top of the work so nothing comes undone, so the zipper doesn't accidentally come undone. But trouser hooks and bars, or hooks and eyes, are much longer. They're designed to fit a waistband, which is usually about 1 inch to 1.25 inches tall. So they're much taller than your typical wire hooks and eyes because, again, they're meant to go onto a waistband. They come in a variety of colors. I don't often see them in different sizes, however. I've usually only seen hooks and bars, trouser hooks and bars in the same size, but they will come in a variety of colors. I've got black and silver here. I will install the black one just so you can see it against my fabric. Again, you don't have to install this for this sample. You're welcome to do another snap or another hook and eye or hook and bar, but I'm going to show you how these install. It is essentially the same as the trouser hook, as the wire hook and eye, where the bar will sit here centered on this tailor's tack and straddling the tailor's tack and sitting right there straddling the center front line. Whereas the hook, which again has a similar hooked-like shape, you've got one side down here that sits flat, it's got all the holes and stuff on it, and then it hooks up and around. There's also another mechanism in here, a tiny little hump that you may not be able to see, but there is a little hump in between here, just like the wire hooks and eyes, that acts as a temporary catch or a latch for when you've got this positioned properly. But this flat side that has all the holes on it, this will sit flat on your fabric. And again, the hook is going to hook up and around in this direction, similar to what we did here with the hook coming up and around like that. So the edge of the hook will sit right at center front. I'll go ahead and install these really quick. It's the same stitch, same technique. I've got to get more thread in my needle because I used up all my thread. Don't forget to wax your thread if you need to, especially when you get to the end of the spool, when your thread starts to get all curly-Q and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. It helps to wax your thread. Remember to place it between a piece of muslin and iron it so the thread permeates, the wax permeates the thread. Practice putting your knots in your thread. Okay, I'll do the bar and then I'll do the hook. Actually, let me do the hook first because it's going to take a little bit longer. Now, when we did the wire hook and bar, hook and eye, I had to secure it here and through the hook. You don't have to secure this through the hook when you're doing a trouser hook and bar, but it's pretty noticeable where you should be securing it. You've got 2 holes down here, 2 holes up here, and 1 big hole over here. And that's all we need to do is secure them through all those holes. So it's 5 holes I've got to secure through. I'm going to hold my piece in place. Remember to keep it straddled along that mark so it's centered in the right location. And I will come up through my fabric into one of those holes and get to looping. Looping my thread over and over and over. I'll do 3 loops in each of these little holes. So I've got that one, 3 loops of thread over there. I'm going to put my needle down through my work and travel over to this next hole over here. Pull that to the back, pull the thread to the back of my work, and then push my needle up through that next hole. And loop over and over again. 1, 2, 3. Note that every time I do that, I have to kind of bend my fabric. Your hooks and eyes and hardware, they're not going to bend, but your fabric absolutely will. There we go. And then I'll travel over to this big old eye over here. Again, you can skip up to these 2 and then do this one last. It doesn't matter. For this one, I don't want a whole bunch of stitches showing on the outside here because I'm traveling pretty far to get from this point to this point. So I'm going to travel my needle through my fabric, through my 2 layers of fabric, keeping my fingers underneath so I can feel whether the needle comes through. I can see my needle is in the general vicinity for where that eye will be. I'm just going to scoot this out of the way for right now. Pull my needle through. And you shouldn't see any thread on the back where I traveled. And then push my needle up through that big old eye in my hook. Now this is a much larger hook, so I'm going to kind of travel my looped stitches down the edge here. It doesn't really matter. You can do 4, 5, 6 of these. Again, there are some decorative stitches that you can use, but I prefer to just loop this over and over. So every time I took a little stitch and I go down and back up through the eye, rather than keeping my needle in the same place, I just kind of worked my way down a little bit and a little bit back up. So we've got kind of a bar of stitches. I'm going to travel my needle again from here over to here, and I'm going to put that needle between my 2 layers of fabric so I don't have a big old line of thread in the back. Again, you are welcome to just keep that thread traveling in the back, but this is good practice. Gotta see where my needle is coming up. Make sure I get it close to one of these little holes. That's close enough. It's not great, but it's close enough. And then bring my needle up through one of these holes. And then again, loop it about 3 times. And then I'll travel my needle over to that other hole and went down over here, came back up through this other hole here, and loop this thread over. 1, 2, 3. Take a little knot, tiny little stitch, picking up a couple of fibers. And again, take a little stitch, picking up a couple of fibers. And before this loop of thread closes up, I'm going to put my needle through that loop, pull it tight to anchor my thread, and then travel my thread in between my 2 layers somewhere. Pull my thread taut, snip as close as I can to the fabric without cutting the fabric, and let that thread slide back into place. So that's the orientation of my hook. Remember the flat side with all the eyes sits flat against your fabric, and then the hook comes up. And in this orientation, we've got the hook hooking away from the folded edge of the fabric. I'll move over here to where my bar is and get that into place. Putting another knot in my thread, so that's ready to go. Same old, same old. Get this positioned. Do my best to hold it into place so it doesn't go slip sliding around. And start getting my needle up through one of these holes. There we go. Anchor that knot. And loop, loop, loop. 1, 2, 3. Put my needle down into my work, travel over to that other eye as best I can. If you find it really difficult, again, just push your needle through, bring the thread to the back of your work, and then push the needle back up through the other eye. Loop it again. 1, 2, 3. Now again, I'm going to travel. This one's a little bit off center, so I'm going to have to kind of force it to go down a little bit more. I'm going to have to travel kind of far to get up here, and I don't want a big long line of thread showing on the back, so I'm going to travel in between my 2 layers of fabric, keeping my fingers underneath there so I can feel if the needle pokes too far. And again, I can scoot this out of the way and be sure that my needle is getting close to where it needs to be. So now I don't have any thread showing through there, and then I'll just poke up through one of these holes, one of these eyes here. Oops. I'm going to push my bar down a little bit because it's pushing a little too far up, but it's okay. As long as it's straddled along that center front line. Again, your 2 eyes should be on either side. You don't want to install the bar going, cattywampus. We don't want it tilting either way. We want to keep it as centered as possible on the center front line for this sample. And back down through all the layers and up through that same hole. 1, 2, 3. Travel over to the next hole. And 1, 2, 3. Pick up a few little fibers just beside the bar. And again, a few little fibers. And before this loop of thread closes, put my needle through the loop, pull the thread taut, let it anchor itself, and then travel my needle between my 2 layers. Bring it up somewhere. Pull it taut. Clip it as close to the fabric as possible without clipping the fabric, and let that tension pull that thread back into place. So we've got 3 closures. Options beyond using zippers, or in conjunction with zippers. You might use snaps instead of zippers. You may use a hook and eye or wire hook and eye to assist at the top of a zipper, and practice putting those closures together, your snap, your hook, your wire hook and eye, hook into place, and your hook and bar. See if I can show you this. That hook just slides under that bar, and it should, you won't hear a snap, but you will feel a bit of a thunk as that bar goes over that little loop. There is a tiny loop in there to hold that in place. So it should be nice and tight. And that is your additional closures. Again, make sure this is as vertical as possible. We shouldn't have samples sliding which ways. It shouldn't be going like this, shouldn't be going like this. We should have everything as vertical as possible. If you installed everything with the correct orientation and in the right place, you shouldn't have a problem with that. Do be careful when you're undoing the snaps. You don't want to just go ripping the 2 pieces of fabric apart, because it could tear your fabric depending on what kind of fabric you're using, especially on actual garments or costumes. And that takes care of the additional closure sample.